At 2:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 3, 2026, the president of a sovereign nation was removed from his bedroom by foreign military forces and placed aboard a warship bound for a detention facility 5,000 kilometers away. Nicolás Maduro, the elected leader of Venezuela, regardless of the legitimacy debates surrounding that election, was extracted from Fort Tiuna in Caracas by Delta Force operators, while American F-35s suppressed air defenses across 4 Venezuelan states. By dawn, he was aboard the USS Iwo Jima. By nightfall, he stood in a Manhattan federal courthouse, blindfolded in handcuffs, and formally charged with narco-terrorism. The operation was called Absolute Resolve. What it resolved, however, was not a drug trafficking case. It was a question that had been quietly circulating through foreign ministries, defense departments, and intelligence agencies for the better part of 2 years. How far would the new American doctrine actually go? On January 3rd, the world received its answer. The United States, under President Donald Trump's second administration, demonstrated that it was prepared to conduct unilateral military operations to seize heads of state, without United Nations authorization, without host nation consent, and without a formal declaration of war. The legal justification provided was narrow. Maduro had been indicted in 2020 on drug charges in the Southern District of New York, and the president possessed inherent constitutional authority to enforce American law. But the geopolitical message was comprehensive. This was not Panama in 1989. This was not a Cold War proxy intervention. This was something categorically different. And the silence that followed, from NATO allies, from international institutions, from regional powers who might have been expected to object, revealed something equally significant. Operation Absolute Resolve did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of a pressure campaign that had been escalating since late 2025, when the Trump administration began positioning naval assets off the Venezuelan coast under the banner of counter-narcotics operations. In the months preceding January 3rd, American forces destroyed more than 30 vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, all allegedly connected to drug trafficking networks. Air defense systems across the Caribbean were quietly neutralized. Caribbean airspace was restricted. Starlink satellites, operated by SpaceX, led by Elon Musk, were pre-positioned to provide communications infrastructure for Venezuelan civilians in the event of a transition. The CIA had embedded a small operational team inside Venezuela as early as August 2025, tasked with tracking Maduro's movements, his routines, his security protocols. They knew where he slept. They knew the layout of his compound. They knew the thickness of the steel door to his safe room. When the operation launched, more than 150 military aircraft participated. The Venezuelan electrical grid was jammed. Radar installations were destroyed. The night sky over Caracas lit up with explosions at Higuerote Airport, at military installations in La Guaira, Miranda, and Aragua. Delta Force operators breached Maduro's residence at Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, and extracted him while he was attempting to reach his reinforced safe room. His wife, Celia Flores, was taken simultaneously. Both were transported to the USS Iwo Jima, then flown to New York. The entire operation, from breach to extraction, took less than 90 minutes. What happened next, or rather, what did not happen, was more telling than the operation itself. The United Nations issued a statement through a spokesperson for Secretary General Antonio Guterres, calling the operation a dangerous precedent. China demanded Maduro's immediate release, describing the strike as a clear violation of international law. Russia condemned the action. Cuba announced that 32 of its citizens, military personnel deployed to Venezuela, had been killed in the raid. Iran protested, but the statement from the European Union was measured, cautious. The United Kingdom noted that while it was not involved in the operation, it had long supported a transition of power in Venezuela and regarded Maduro as illegitimate due to his disputed 2024 election. Germany did not issue a formal condemnation. France remained conspicuously silent. NATO, as an institution, said nothing. The Organization of American States did not convene an emergency session. The International Criminal Court did not open an investigation. And within 72 hours, the conversation had shifted, not to whether the operation violated international law, but to what would happen next in Venezuela. It was as though the global system had collectively decided that certain principles, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition on the use of force, were no longer absolute. They were conditional. But conditional on what? Within hours of Maduro's capture, Venezuela's defaulted government bonds surged by up to 20%. Bonds issued by PDVSA, the state oil company, rose by more than 6 cents. Markets were pricing in a future where American corporations would have direct access to Venezuela's oil infrastructure, the largest proven reserves in the world. Stock prices for oilfield service companies like Schlumberger and Halliburton jumped. Refinery operators such as Valero Energy and Marathon Petroleum saw immediate gains. The calculus was straightforward. If the United States was now willing to militarily remove a government it deemed hostile and install a compliant interim authority, then investments that had been considered unrecoverable were suddenly viable. Debt restructuring, estimated at between $150 and $170 billion, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was being priced into the market as an inevitability. But there was a second-order effect. Sovereign debt across Latin America began to reprice. If Washington could unilaterally decide that a government was illegitimate and remove it by force, what prevented similar operations elsewhere? Bond traders began asking questions about Colombia, where Trump had issued veiled threats. About Cuba, which had lost military personnel in the Venezuela operation and was now facing renewed American pressure. About Mexico, where Trump had openly suggested military action against cartel networks. Risk premiums adjusted accordingly. Capital began flowing out of the region, not in panic, but in recalibration. Venezuela produces roughly 1% of global oil supply. Under normal circumstances, this would be insufficient to move markets. But these were not normal circumstances. China had been importing approximately 470,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, supported by over $2 billion in Chinese investments. Those supply lines were now under direct American control. Beijing issued strong statements demanding Maduro's release, but the energy implications were inescapable. China's strategic oil reserves, already constrained by Middle Eastern instability, had just lost another source. More importantly, the operation signaled that the United States was prepared to use military force to control energy infrastructure in its hemisphere, a doctrine that had been discussed theoretically but never implemented at this scale. The implications extended beyond Venezuela. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, already locked in a proxy conflict in Yemen, were now watching to see if Washington would tolerate regional actors asserting similar control over energy choke points. Brazil, which had dramatically increased its oil production in recent years, suddenly found itself in a different strategic position. If the U.S. was willing to seize Venezuelan oil fields, what would prevent pressure on other regional producers to align with American energy policy? The question was not paranoia. It was risk assessment, and oil prices remarkably rose only 1%. The market was signaling that it expected American control to stabilize, not disrupt supply. But there was another energy dimension that received less attention in the immediate aftermath. Venezuela's electrical grid had been one of the primary targets during the operation. Not just military installations, but civilian power infrastructure. The message was clear. The United States possessed the capability to darken an entire nation within minutes. This was not theoretical cyber warfare or distant drone strikes. This was the systematic dismantling of critical infrastructure as a prelude to regime change. And if it could be done in Venezuela, it could be done elsewhere. Countries across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia began reassessing their vulnerabilities. How dependent were they on imported technology for their power grids? How secure were their telecommunications networks? How quickly could a technologically superior adversary disable their defenses? These were not new questions, but they had suddenly become urgent. Defense ministries across the developing world began requesting audits of their infrastructure. Contracts were signed for alternative systems, often with Chinese or Russian suppliers, ironically accelerating the technological decoupling that American policymakers claimed to oppose. The operation had demonstrated American capability, but it had also demonstrated American willingness, and that willingness was, in many ways, more significant than the capability itself. Within Venezuela, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president by the National Assembly on January 5th. She had reportedly been in Russia at the time of the operation, though other sources placed her in Caracas. The confusion itself was revealing. The Chavista power structure, which had survived economic collapse, mass immigration, and years of sanctions, was now operating without its central figure. Key military commanders remained in place, but their loyalty was untested. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez confirmed that at least 100 people had been killed in the operation. Civilians, military personnel, and Cuban advisors. The death toll was still being compiled. Caracas was quiet, streets were empty, businesses remained closed. Venezuelans lined up outside supermarkets and gas stations, uncertain whether the government would continue to function. In Miami, Buenos Aires, Madrid, and Santiago, Venezuelan immigrant communities celebrated. But inside Venezuela, the mood was more complex. Maduro had been deeply unpopular, but his removal by American military force was not liberation, it was humiliation. Anti-American sentiment, which had always simmered below the surface, now had a concrete focus. And throughout Latin America, governments were recalculating their positions. Mexico remained silent. Brazil issued a tepid statement. Argentina, under a pro-American government, offered tacit support. Colombia faced pressure from Washington to cooperate with whatever transition Washington envisioned. The Monroe Doctrine, dormant for a century, was being revived, not as a defensive posture, but as an assertion of control. The reaction from Cuban leadership was particularly significant. 32 Cuban military personnel had been killed during the operation, not in Venezuela by accident, but as part of formal military cooperation agreements between Havana and Caracas. These were not advisors caught in crossfire. They were active combatants defending Venezuelan installations. The Cuban government issued a statement on Facebook, a platform officially blocked in Cuba, but used by state institutions for international communication, confirming the deaths and describing them as soldiers who had lost their lives in combat while carrying out missions on behalf of the country's military. The language was careful. It acknowledged Cuban military presence in Venezuela, but framed it as defensive. More importantly, it signaled that Cuba considered the American operation an act of war, not just against Venezuela, but against Cuban interests. And yet, Havana did not retaliate, did not mobilize, did not even expel American diplomats, because there were no American diplomats in Cuba to expel. The response was purely rhetorical. This restraint was not weakness, it was calculation. Cuba, which had survived 60 years of American pressure, understood that direct confrontation with Washington in 2026 would be suicidal. But the incident created a new dynamic. The United States had killed Cuban military personnel in a third country, and Cuba had absorbed the blow without response. That precedent would not be forgotten. In Beijing, the response was more complex. Chinese state media framed the operation as evidence that American imperialism remained the primary threat to global stability. Foreign ministry spokespersons demanded Maduro's immediate release and described the operation as of a clear violation of international law. But behind the rhetorical condemnation, Chinese policymakers were conducting a different analysis. If the United States was willing to use military force to secure energy resources in Latin America, would it consider similar operations in regions where Chinese interests were more directly threatened? Would Washington attempt to interdict Chinese energy imports from the Middle East? Would it pressure African nations hosting Chinese mining operations? The Venezuela operation had not directly harmed Chinese interests. China's oil imports from Venezuela had been declining for years. The $2 billion in Chinese investments were already considered sunk costs. But it had revealed something about American strategic thinking. Energy security was now being pursued through military means, not just economic leverage. And that revelation required a response. Within days of the operation, China announced an accelerated timeline for its strategic petroleum reserve expansion. New agreements were signed with Russia, Iran, and several African producers. Alternative shipping routes were explored. Payment systems that bypassed American financial infrastructure were prioritized. The operation in Caracas had not weakened China. It had focused Chinese strategy. And that focus would have consequences that would unfold over years, not weeks. The most profound effect, however, was not financial or political. It was doctrinal. The Trump administration's national security strategy, released in December 2025, had stated explicitly that the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. But the Venezuela operation clarified what this meant. America was not retreating from the world. It was consolidating control over its near abroad and demonstrating, with overwhelming force, that it would act unilaterally when its interests were threatened. NATO allies, who had spent the better part of 2 years debating how to respond to Trump's second term, were now faced with a reality they had tried to avoid. The United States was not asking for consensus. It was announcing decisions. The question for European capitals, for Asian allies, for anyone who had relied on the post-World War II order, was no longer whether they agreed with American actions. It was whether they would oppose them, and if they did, what would that opposition look like? Diplomatic statements, economic sanctions, military countermeasures? The answer so far had been silence, and that silence was its own kind of answer. There is a difference between a controversial military operation and a redefinition of the international system. The former can be debated, condemned, and eventually absorbed into the historical record as an anomaly. The latter cannot. Operation Absolute Resolve crossed that threshold not because of its tactical execution, which was, by all accounts, overwhelming, but because of what it normalized. For the first time since the end of World War II, a major power had conducted a military operation to seize the head of state of a sovereign nation, transport him across international borders, and place him on trial in a domestic court. The justification, enforcement of a 2020 drug indictment, was legally tenuous at best. The United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. Neither condition applied. International legal scholars, including those sympathetic to American foreign policy, struggled to construct a coherent legal framework for the operation. But the operation succeeded anyway, and that success created a new baseline. If the United States could remove Maduro with impunity, what would prevent China from arguing that it had the authority to seize Taiwanese officials under its own legal frameworks? What would stop Russia from claiming that it could extract Ukrainian leaders to face trial in Moscow? The precedent was not about Venezuela. It was about power. And power, once demonstrated, does not need to be justified. It simply needs to be accepted. Within 72 hours of Maduro's capture, the conversation had shifted from legality to logistics. Not whether the operation was permissible under international law, but how Venezuela's transition would be managed. Trump announced that the United States would run the country until a transition could be arranged, though he provided no details about what that transition would entail or who would lead it. Oil companies began preliminary discussions about access to Venezuelan fields. Debt restructuring frameworks were being drafted. Interim governance structures were being debated. The international system, in other words, had moved on. And in doing so, it ratified the operation retroactively. This was the point of no return. Not the moment when Maduro was seized, but the moment when the world accepted that seizure as a fait accompli. International law, it turned out, was not a set of binding rules. It was a set of norms that powerful states could reinterpret or discard when those norms became inconvenient. And once that realization settled in, it became impossible to unsee. The operation had another effect that would take longer to manifest, but was perhaps more significant than any immediate geopolitical consequence. It demonstrated that regime change could be achieved not through prolonged occupation, not through proxy wars, not through economic strangulation, but through a single overwhelming application of force. 90 minutes, 150 aircraft, 7 injured American personnel, 100 Venezuelan casualties, and a government decapitated. The efficiency was striking, the cost was minimal. The strategic message was unmistakable. For decades, American military planners had operated under the assumption that regime change required sustained commitment. Nation building, counterinsurgency, long-term occupation. Iraq and Afghanistan had seemed to prove this. But Venezuela suggested otherwise. If the target was small enough, if the military disparity was large enough, if the political will was present, regime change could be surgical. This was a dangerous lesson, not because it was false, but because it was conditionally true. It worked in Venezuela because Venezuela's military was weak, its air defenses obsolete, its government internationally isolated. But the same approach would not work in Iran, would not work in North Korea, would not work in any state with robust defenses or powerful allies. The danger was not that American policymakers would learn the wrong lesson from Venezuela. The danger was that they would learn a selectively correct lesson and apply it in contexts where it did not hold. And by the time that became clear, it would be too late to reverse course. In the days following the operation, Caracas remained unnaturally still. Convenience stores opened sporadically, gasoline stations ran dry, military checkpoints appeared at major intersections, manned by soldiers whose allegiances were unclear. Delcy Rodriguez, now formally recognized as interim president, issued statements calling for calm and continuity. But continuity of what? The Chavista government had been built around a cult of personality. First Chavez, then Maduro. Without that central figure, the structure was hollow. And the United States, for all its declarations about running the country, had not articulated a plan. Trump's press conference on January 3rd was notable for what it avoided. He did not name a successor. He did not outline a timeline. He did not specify what American military presence would look like, though he did not rule out boots on the ground. When asked about the legal justification for the operation, he pivoted to discussing oil reserves and American investments. When pressed on whether this set a precedent for future operations, he dismissed the question. The focus, he said, was Venezuela. But the implications extended far beyond Venezuela. In Europe, far-right political parties seized on the operation as evidence that national sovereignty could be reasserted through strength. In China, state media framed the operation as proof that the United States remained an imperial power. In Moscow, analysts noted that if Washington could violate Venezuelan sovereignty, Russia's actions in Ukraine looked comparatively restrained. The narrative was fragmenting along ideological lines, but the underlying fact remained constant. The international order, as it had been understood for 70 years, no longer functioned, and no one, it seemed, had a plan for what came next. The question of what American control actually meant remained unanswered. Trump had declared that the United States would run Venezuela, but the mechanics of that arrangement were unclear. Would American military forces occupy Caracas? Would civilian administrators be deployed? Would Venezuelan institutions continue to function under American oversight, or would they be dissolved and rebuilt? The ambiguity was not accidental. It reflected genuine uncertainty within the administration about what success looked like. Some officials envisioned a rapid transition, install a friendly government, secure oil contracts, declare victory, and withdraw. Others saw an opportunity for deeper transformation, restructure Venezuela's economy, dismantle Chavista networks, create a model for hemispheric governance. These were fundamentally different objectives, and they required fundamentally different commitments. The debate had not been resolved before the operation launched. It was being conducted now in real time while the world watched. This was not careful planning. This was improvisation. And improvisation, at this scale, carried risks that no one had fully calculated. Nicolás Maduro remains in federal detention in New York. His next court appearance is scheduled for March 17, 2026. His lawyers have argued that he is a prisoner of war, not a criminal defendant. The judge, a Clinton appointee, has ordered him held without bail. Venezuela's oil fields remain under contested control. China has not resumed imports. American companies have not yet secured access. The transition Trump promised has not materialized. What has materialized instead is uncertainty. Not the chaotic uncertainty of a world in collapse, but the structured uncertainty of a world in transition. From one set of rules to another, from one balance of power to another, from one understanding of sovereignty to something else entirely. The operation in Caracas was not an ending. It was a signal. And the world is still deciding how to interpret it. The story, in other words, has not concluded. It has simply entered a new chapter. And that chapter is being written now, in real time, by decisions that are being made in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Brussels, and in capitals that thought they understood the rules of the game. But the rules have changed, and no one is entirely certain what the new rules are, which means the most dangerous phase is not the operation itself. It is what comes after. When systems break, they do not collapse all at once. They fracture slowly along fault lines that were always there but never visible. And once the fracture begins, it cannot be stopped. It can only be managed or not.